Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Paulina Korobkiewicz. I'm a Polish photographer and visual artist, currently based in London. Um, my work explores public space. Um, I'm particularly interested in how our surroundings testify of our collective history. My focus in the recent bodies of work has been on how the political transition influenced contemporary landscape and interiors in Poland. And as I was brought up right next to the Lithuanian border, I have been exploring some changes there as well. Um, I use bookmaking in my process. Um, can you hear us? Can anybody Can anybody say if they can hear us? I think we're having a bit of a technical issue here. Interiors in Poland. Oh, sorry guys. I would just just this is the first time we're doing this, so I'm not sure if you can hear us or not. Bear with us. Okay, great. Okay, yeah, you can hear us. Awesome. As I was saying, yeah, I use bookmaking in my practice, and this is really how mine and Natalia's collaboration started. My current solo show is on display at Centrala Gallery until the end of the month. It's called Udarny, and obviously, as we're having a current crisis, we're live streaming with you this evening. I'm here with Natalia, the author of essays accompanying the show.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for tuning in today amongst all the coronavirus scare. So I'm Natalia, and alongside my daily job in policy, I also write and do research. My research background is somehow eclectic. So my academic background is in anthropology and economic development, but I've written essays on post-socialism, urban anthropology, gender. I've written some academic papers on civic tech and data and economic development as well. And I'm originally from Poland, and similarly to Paulina, I'm based in London now.
We have known each other for a very long time, so it was a very obvious choice to turn to Natalia with this project. I'll tell you a little bit more now about Udarny and just the background of how I found the material that is exhibited. I was already working on a project on post-socialist interiors in general, which was really exploring nostalgia of those spaces and leading on from my observations growing up in post-socialist Poland. We're both born in the 90s after the fall of Soviet Union. One summer in 2018, I was exploring for more images in Alytus actually. Um, and after a whole day of just really trying to take some photographs and not really finding anything, me and my mom actually, we were driving out of town, and what struck me was this huge tower block just as you leave the town. And we walked in, and it was furniture shop downstairs, and so we left the shop, and there was a staircase leading up to the other stories of the building. Um, and that's where I discovered the abandoned headquarters of what used to be Alytus Medvilnas Kombinatas, which is a Alytus textile factory shut down. But what was left after was these incredibly looking spaces, almost like film sets, with things that were left on the desks and around the building that just looked like time has stopped there, like someone just stood up and left. And I started photographing, but as we were about to leave, um, I found all this crazy material that was just going to be thrown away. So that's really that one day was that discovery was really what started the project. And obviously I took what I could with me, um, but it was really when I was scanning the material, I was thinking about a year later that I had spoken to Natalia, that we kind of came up with the idea of Udarny Trud.
So I knew for a while that Paulina was working on a new project. I knew the premise. I knew that she discovered that factory in Lithuania and that she gathered a lot of material from there. But we never really had a conversation about it until that one time when I was actually reading a book about labor. So I was reading this book by David Graeber called Bullshit Jobs, which I, by the way, very highly recommend, which talks about how some of the jobs in our current capitalist system are basically non-essential. And Paulina mentioned that she's processing the material from the factory, and we got into this conversation about the meaning of labor, about what work meant back then in that particular factory in Lithuania, as opposed to what it means right now, and it was fascinating, and we suddenly realized that actually the body of work that Paulina is working on is timeless. It's not only limited to that particular factory, but it can also teach us something about how we see work in our societies as well. So we've decided that I will do some more research on that factory specifically, but also on post-socialist and socialist understanding of labor, to basically write essays that will go with the final exhibition.
Yes, and for me, these generational changes was something that I really just became interested in after moving to London. When I was making trips back home, I started photographing what I saw around me every time I went back, and obviously that's this interest, like I said, was already there. The diary of really transition and documenting what I consider important in that. It's a very subjective process, but it's something that it's very close to me. The photographs I found in the factory, I juxtaposed in sort of the final, the way you can see it in the exhibition. I juxtaposed them with the photographs I actually took of the spaces. But this is not an exhibition about an abandoned factory, and the photographs of what is left is my sort of bridge between the archival material and through the contrast of having past and present together. I think these narratives of what labor meant then, what building the new system for the people captured in the photographs, for the people in that factory, but also in many factories around the Soviet Union, cultivating the same ideas.
There are a few things to unpack here. So, first of all, the immense glorification and ritualization of labor were at the very, very core of socialism as a system. So, labor was perceived as the highest value in terms of political and ethical systems, and laborers were perceived as national heroes who were quite literally contributing to building their nations. In the case of a Polish People's Republic constitution, labor was actually written into it as well, and that was similar in the Soviet Constitution of 1918. Basically, for an ordinary worker, for people working in those factories, the labor was the front line of socialism. It was their productive means to create a new society. It was also an indicator of their values, commitment to their country. It was a very core. It was a core duty of demonstrating their their patriotism, and the most productive workers became heroes. And it's you can see it when you go and see Paulina's exhibition in Birmingham. There are some photos of the most productive workers, the worker of the month, worker
along with the percentages that they exceeded. Is that whole idea, the Stakhanov movement, the name Udarny. I'll pass it on to you to sort of, explain the idea. But I think it's extremely important that this is something that people take from the show, and the fact that you don't have a real result from exceeding those norms.
Yeah, so the status of the person was determined by their productivity and by their efficiency. And the title of the exhibition, Udarny Trud, comes from the Russian word udarniks, which is basically an expression meaning super productive, very enthusiastic labor. It can also be translated as strike labor. But the workers in factories, in mines, in every kind of physical workplace were strongly encouraged to break the records of productivity, and the price that they were getting for it was recognition. Financial gains didn't necessarily follow. As Paulina just said, it was mainly about the praise and about the glory of being one of the people who are building their nation.
Yeah, and it's more of a something you can't really pinpoint. Is this ideology, people working for the status, for things that don't really change their life in a physical sense, but you know, add to this whole idea of building a new system together. But it's
Yeah.
something that obviously for me, coming from Poland and moving to London, I have developed quite a strong interest in. I have been analyzing my surroundings every time I would go back and make a trip back home. Um, in the Udarny Trud project, what's so important in the contrast is that we can clearly see that although these photographs show people who are completely anonymous, and I think that was, for me, it was a big part of this project, because this is not the only place that went through this sort of phase of competing in workplaces. It was many other places. It was happening in Poland. It was happening really across the Soviet Union. So that's why I think there are some universal truths captured in the fact that these people were young then. The system was the promise for them. This was, yeah.
Yeah, and a part of this is also the role that factory played in the broader socio-political landscape of post. I keep on saying post-socialism, but what I actually mean is socialism. Uh, Basically, the way that currently a factory is just a place where you work. Back then, the factory was a center of social life. It was a place of production, but also of consumption. So you can see photos of people having balls, people having extracurricular activities in the factory, people writing poems and songs to celebrate the factory's anniversaries or best workers,
or a visit of some sort of governmental official. That's something that was always, giving flowers. You can see that in the archival material that is found as well. And I think that was, for me, that was what was so fascinating when I found the material. That obviously that was something that was going to end up in the skip, because something of such great importance now is not useful to anyone. Obviously, like Lithuania, I'm sure, like most post-Soviet states, is not very doesn't think really nicely of that time. It was something that, yeah.
And the contrast between that factory being a social center, political center, cultural center back then, and now completely abandoned. I think it's something more than just an abandoned workplace. It's basically a lifestyle that was rejected, a lifestyle that belongs to the previous era and is no more. And juxtaposing, to me as not a photographer, juxtaposing the photos of the interactions that people had back then in the factory with the interiors of the factory right now, that's a really powerful message of what's happening with that time right now, and what's
there are some comparisons we'll expand on later on, how obviously there is a comparison of the capitalist system and these ideas we can draw, but also I think it's a story of a sort of a cheated generation that was building something that nobody predicted would collapse overnight. And the ideology was so strong and so implemented in people that I think these photographs of these spaces being completely empty and gathering dust and a little bit irrelevant, the certificates that people were given for doing so well are going to be, end up on the skip. It's a nostalgic idea, but I think there is some truth in that, and that just sort of shows how sometimes what we believe in maybe isn't what it is at the time. Yeah. So again, I like I started saying, there is something that for me I started exploring back when I was a student at Campbell College of Arts. In 2015, I graduated with a photo book called Disco Polo. This was the first time I really completed the project um, back home while I was away from home. So I adopted a sort of a third person's perspective on the places I was very familiar with. Um, and I simply photographed the spaces that I have been seeing and looking at throughout my childhood. A bit confused why they look the way they do. I would, like I said at the beginning, we were both born after the fall of Soviet Union. So um, although we weren't part of the system, we were constantly surrounded by the reminiscence of it. And for me, that visual interest started through just watching the spaces my grandparents took me to. I spent really a lot of time with them when I was little, and I remember being taken to like an old, town hall or a post office where um, I couldn't quite understand why, comparing to the Western movies, for example, it doesn't look quite the same. The same thing was with my primary school. The same thing was with many of these spaces that I found myself, but I couldn't quite understand. And also, the conversations, I think, were very quite present as well, both from our grandparents, our parents, comparing there and then now. Um, and when I first made the trip back home after moving to London in 2012, I just started capturing those images, and that resulted in Disco Palo. Um, I knew that this would be a book. I needed some context for this research I've been doing. Obviously, the certain sense of contrast. Um, the fidelity to previous fidelity to Russia juxtaposed with the new devotion to America, this hybrid of Western capitalism and our post-Soviet past. It is something that I turned to Natalia one day and I showed her my research. Like I said.
Yeah. At the time, I was actually doing my own exploration of post-socialism and post-socialist architecture. So I was doing some research. I was looking at the reactions and emotions that socialist buildings evoke right now in the post-socialist Poland, and I was trying to map whether there is a correlation in how people perceive the buildings and how they perceive the previous political system. And it was fascinating. I was interviewing a lot of people from my hometown, the same hometown where Paulina took photos to her photo book Disco Polo. And some of the reactions were really striking. I had people who would say that ideally they would like to see all the socialist buildings burn and demolished, and very, very strong emotions um, associated with the previous system. And a big part of that was actually, what can we do now in Poland with the very visual aesthetic aspect of the urban landscape? And this is what the essay that I wrote to Disco Polo is basically about. How do we reconcile the fact that Poland, geographically and historically, has always been too west for the east, but too east for the west, and how it shows in our urban landscape, and how can we move forward from there, and what can we do now to make our urban space more pleasant, but also without completely erasing the history that this space portrays. So that's what Disco Polo was about from my perspective, and that was the first instance of our collaboration. And I think it was very interesting because in some way it felt like it's our journey of rediscovering our identities.
Absolutely.
and looking at where we came from and where we grew up from a completely different, from an outsider's perspective.
Yes, absolutely. So we're considering, I think, what we saw then, and moving out of a place and coming back. I think that's something that creates the distance, but also through experiences that you gain on the way, you can sort of reanalyze and reconnect in a way through this work that we were both doing at the time. Um, for me, it was more of a curiosity as well. I guess just why do things look the way they do? And as you can see in most of these, in pretty much all of these photographs, apart from the found material in Udarny Trud, you can't see any people. And for me, obviously, these photographs are very much about people, and they show everything. But the person itself, I think, when you show a person, the photograph becomes immediately about the person, where they come from, what they like, what they do, and I really wanted to avoid that because I thought that the public space already showed so much and told such a big story about what happened and what's been done. It's not just that it's post-socialist and we've got tower blocks, and of course that's obvious, but there are certain gestures in the public space that you can find that for me testify something more than that, and that's this new like I said earlier, hybrid reality of the two spaces, so the post-socialist and the capitalist. And so for example, painting tower blocks in pastel shades, that's something that you can see a lot in Disco Polo, making the spaces nicer, but actually, that whether they're nicer, that's very that's a subjective question. Um, yeah, we
Yeah, so Disco Polo was our first formal collaboration, and then we've also to continue this rediscovering our identities, to continue with this. We
Well, I think initially
started.
we started, and I think that came before Disco Polo. No, that's something that we.
Well, in around the same time, we started working on a project that we never actually completed, but it was a fascinating journey. We were basically finding Polish migrants in London, and I would interview them. Paulina would take photos because we were trying to understand what are the different dimensions and different stories of people who, exactly like us, bought a one-way ticket from Poland to London, and and where did they end up, and what kind of adventures did they have on the way, and doing this kind of exploration of people like us in our current situations, while retrospectively looking at the visual and aesthetics aspects of a place where we come from, I think was a really interesting clash of
Well, I think it just gave us a different perspective.
yeah.
We obviously came to London for different reasons. All of us as a Polish community here. And I think it just puts things into perspectives when you see the journey of people who, for example, came without knowing the language, who found themselves being cheated or found themselves in very difficult positions, um, and not at the same time. We've had people who are doing completely incredible things and had a very easy start, and but because we both, I get like I said before, because we both sort of came individually, and the idea was to study here, and the idea was to integrate to English society essentially at the beginning. I think to find ourselves in the Polish community and discovering the reasons why people made this decision. Uh, but it's something to do with identity, like you said.
Very
Before,
much
yeah.
so, because none of us intended. We came here not wanting to look back necessarily. We didn't come here to make art or do research on post-socialism of Poland.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah,
and that's it's really interesting how we both kept coming back to that theme. And
I think it's our background together. I think that we for me before the fact that Natalia has been writing to my project with me, collaborating with me on these projects that I have been doing visually, on my visual research, and your written material, your written research has definitely worked together, because We both know exactly. Well, our background is the same. We grew up in a small town on the border with Lithuania in eastern Poland, and we went through school pretty much also parallelly. The reason to the decision to move to London for me was very spontaneous. It was something that we didn't decide at the same time, but life sort of brought us to be very close to each other. I mean, now we're in South London. I'm 5 minutes away from you, and we're talking about this project, and I think that's really special because for both of us, I think we're the first generation that really, if I can say that, is not ashamed of coming from a post-socialist state. It's not. We're in fact looking at it in a very different way, and again, like I said, we came here to study. We've throughout our education, thinking maybe we'll be doing something different. We actually revisited the environment that was very familiar to both of us.
Yeah, and
not to say that this is the only thing that I think our work will be exploring, but at this stage, especially with this discovery, I think it felt really right, and yeah,
very much. And I think this is almost a continuation of that curious exploration of the world that we've started doing since we were very young. So our parents have been friends since we were born.
Yeah, since forever.
And since forever.
Yeah.
and when we were around 5 or 6, we went on holiday to France. That was the first big trip abroad, and I think that was the first time when both of us, as really, really small children, we realized how different our reality is to what we saw then.
Well, I think it's really important also to say that we both, our parents. This is to put into context. It's like neither of our parents had money, and it wasn't about going to France and seeing, going to restaurants and doing all the touristy things. It was just about seeing the place. I think for them and for us, we would pack a tent. We'd pack tinned food, and we would go and we would see all these different places. We'd drive through Europe. It was a wonderful time to be together with each other, but also to look out through the window and make those comparisons, like you're saying.
And we drove all the way, and we could see how the landscape was gradually shifting. What we saw was, first big, really wide German roads and very neat lawns and beautiful buildings, and then Paris, which was just stunning with a completely different architecture. Everything was like from a fairy tale, especially for a 6-year-old child. And I think that's the point when we maybe subconsciously started to question why our environment, why our urban aesthetics doesn't look like this, and
Yes.
How is it that we are different? And then when we became older, we started to more consciously perhaps ask those questions, and we started to dive slightly deeper into the historical context, and we're trying to basically understand why the streets of Suwałki don't look like the streets of Paris,
But I think,
also that curiosity that our parents managed to awaken in us. I think that's really important because we didn't necessarily feel worse because of the place we came from. I think the main point was that it was different and it was interesting, and we wanted to see why is that.
And again, I think for me, like you say, it wasn't that we felt worse, but I at least heard enough people tell me about their experience of how they, for example, migrated to America in the 80s, 90s, and how they felt this way. So when I came here, I already knew that there was this mode of us feeling inferior due to economical reasons, due to us being isolated by the Iron Curtain for so long, and it's something that I think these projects for me were sort of crushing as well. But again, I think we're also a sort of a cheated generation, just like the people in these found photographs who spend their youth building a system that was a lie and that didn't work out. And when you compare to, I guess that's just my sort of reflection on Udarny truth. We could open to questions, I guess, now, if anybody has any questions. that would be something that we find out if it works or not. A second.
Oh, and if you have questions, just type them in the live chat section.
Yeah, we just about figured out how to see them. So if there is any, we can see them. It's good. We can answer them. I'm just thinking what to add as well. Well, this to the project. Something that maybe we haven't said it yet is then and now. And obviously, in the exhibition, there is a part of the essay called Reflections that you have written.
So what became really apparent to us was that although the cult of labour as very much embedded in the system was something specific to socialism, I started to question to what extent has this changed in our current society. Because if you look at the trend of overworking, the fact that you don't want to be the first person who leaves the office in the evening, you always wait, and then you end up having all those people basically staying at work until, I don't know, 10 p.m. depending on where you work. And the fact that most of us have LinkedIn profiles and we also very much glorify what we do professionally, I was thinking, how is this different to what we had back then during the socialist times? I mean, the work now isn't understood as building the country, but I think it's understood in a more individualistic sense, like you're building a better future for yourself, while back in the socialist period you would build a better future for your country, but
collectively.
For your collective. But then the hyper productivity and this desire to be the most productive, the most effective, the most efficient worker, I think that's very much still the same.
I think it's
just
working
packaged
for the
up.
idea, titles.
It's just packaged up in a different
way.
In a different way, but the very core of this race to get to the top, but the top is something really elusive and not necessarily, sometimes right now it brings you higher salary, sure, but then you have to compromise your work-life balance, for example, and
it's the status thing again.
It is. It's all about the status.
And what about the life quality? Or, you know what I mean? It's just things that get sacrificed on the way.
Yeah, we have some questions.
Wow. Okay, so the first question, can you elaborate further on how the socialist architecture and public space evoked different reactions within you, both after each different project? Do you want to answer first?
Yeah, so I can start. Yeah. So for me, the project that I was doing specifically was basically trying to see whether people are able to separate the architecture from the time that it came from. And my conclusion was that basically, if they remember the system, if they lived during socialism, they very much can't. So depending on where they were on the kind of party side, whether they were supporting the system, whether they were against, their reaction to the built space would very much follow. So, for example, people who were members of the party would say that old party buildings and monuments should very much remain as they are because they are a part of our history and we should absolutely keep them and they're beautiful. But then people from our generation who were born later on, they had a different opinion in the sense that some of the people I spoke to during my research were basically indifferent. They would say, oh, well, that building, it's a bit ugly, but I don't really mind. And then there was this group of people who, actually similarly to what we do, had a more curious approach, and they thought that this is something that that shows the narrative that our country has been through, and they would almost glorify that aesthetics just because it was something different. So in terms of my personal attitude towards socialist architecture, I think when I was younger, I definitely disliked it. I thought it's not very aesthetically pleasant. But the more I learned about it, the more I learned about history, the more I mapped the nuanced reactions that it provokes. I now think that it's
It's part of
important.
our
It's a
history. It's
part of
part
our
of our
history.
landscape. And I think for me, answering this question is that it's not something that I like or I don't like. It's just something I saw growing up. It's everywhere. At the moment, yes, it's changing. I mean, we're from Eastern Poland, where these changes probably happen slightly slower. And if you go to Warsaw, or Poznań, or Krakow, it's big cities are slightly different. However, you can still find loads of traces everywhere in Poland. Still, what I wouldn't want to happen is for these spaces to just disappear without
Yeah, definitely.
any record. And I just document what I consider important, and I didn't consider that important when I was living there, because when you're so used to something, it's just you see it as a part of your everyday backdrop to your life, really. But there was a certain nostalgia, obviously, with leaving a country you're from, and going somewhere else. And for me, what I saw was I was drawing these comparisons. The first project was really about something different for me. It was about a certain nostalgia. It was about it's called disco polo. It's the genre of music I grew up with. All my friends were listening to it. Our neighbors were listening to it.
Give it a listen after this talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just Google disco polo.
You go weddings, parties. Everybody was, whether I like it myself or not is outside the question. But it definitely, for me, embodies a certain mood, a certain, the disco polo itself was developed abroad in America by migrants, really, Polish migrants in America, Polish Eagles, right? One of the first disco polo bands, right? Am I right? So this is something that, for me, the architecture, the decoration embodied, and I only started seeing it then. Udarny is more of a lucky accident while researching for a different project, World Unit, which is currently on display at Open Eye Gallery in Liverpool. Obviously now, due to coronavirus, it's another, the space is closed, which is the best. But yes, I guess that's my answer to the project. We have another question.
Have you ever felt that you integrated or internalized that feeling of inferiority in your work? It's a very interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. When we talk about inferiority, we talk about feeling a very subjective, very individual feeling of inferior by being abroad. And so our work, my work, your work, your written research about this very particular photographs, for example, is based back home. So obviously you don't feel inferior when you're in the space that you are living in. It's more when you make the trip, when you find yourself lost in the spaces that look so different. And sometimes I think these contracts that the thing is that what I'm photographing is something that is my everyday reality back home. It used to be my everyday, viewpoints as sites, everyday sites. Perhaps these photographs can embody the feeling of inferiority because I am making the comparison while being here, I guess.
Yeah, I think also it's maybe coming to peace with the background that we came from. So perhaps by such a detailed study of that landscape,
because you're saying you're not ashamed, you're putting it in the frame,
but
you're putting it in a book, something that maybe you are ashamed of.
Exactly.
Now I'm showing it like, boom, here
exactly.
you go.
So that's like the journey from inferiority to actually making it an asset in a way, making this particular experience that could have made us felt inferior, making it as something that makes us different, not in a bad way. I think that's something that has been an underlying factor for both of us.
Yeah.
And the fact that by the pure coincidence of growing up in the post-socialist world, we almost became accidental experts in this area because we would see it every day when we were growing up.
So I guess when the question is integrated or internalized, I think it's both of those things. It's something that can be definitely found in our work, but it doesn't come from there. It doesn't, I guess, because it comes from the experiences of our parents, maybe of our families, of our neighbors, of our friends who we've spoken with. So obviously these things are in your head while you're creating the work that you're creating, and in that sense, yes, it is integrated in the project, definitely. The next question is, given modern London's obsession with tearing down and building anew, do you feel the aesthetics of post-socialist society will tell a rich story as the image in your work do for socialism?
That's a great question. I think in the case of London, that's really hard to tell. But my personal take on that would be that the current urban landscape of London is moving so fast that it would be very hard to, in let's say 50, 100 years, to actually have a good detailed image of how this capitalist society looked like, because the speed with which new buildings in London are being built right now, I mean, it's incredible. You go away for 2 months and you come back and then there is a different block. So
yes,
but my answer to this would be that I will be slightly pessimistic, and I don't think it will be as rich as in the case of post-socialism, because post-socialism was the socialist system was very centrally dictated, and the buildings were being built because the central government would say so.
And it's the glory of the system, oversizing. It's
Yeah, and right now, because we have so many different developers, because now we have different flats and new buildings being built around London all the time, I just don't think we will have a coherent visual narrative of that journey.
Yeah, I think that the money decides, and that's a big factor. We have another question. First of all, it's really great to hear you. Yes, Marta. Do
Thanks.
you see any trend or particular interest in visualizing and reflecting the communist past in the work of Eastern European artists? I would like to answer this question because for me, it's something that I definitely noticed. It wasn't something that was happening when I was doing Disco Polo in 2015. This project, Disco Polo, really happened because I was studying Campbell College of Arts, and I was really lost with what I was doing, because the approach, although the Campbell was a fantastic experience and great university, definitely recommend it, but for me, coming with a background from Warsaw School of Photography and a very humanist photography approach, very straight approach to it, not so conceptual, I found myself in third year being really lost. Every time I would go back home, I was photographing what I saw. So it was mostly, that's why the project is mostly around my hometown and again the surroundings of it. And at the end of it, like I said, I found myself develop quite a strong interest in it. And I had a lot of these photographs, and there was a narrative in them that I saw. And upon showing them to the tutors, they said, well, you know what, at the same time, there was the time that self-publishing was something that also started happening. Well, I mean, this was happening for a long time, but I was really introduced to it then, and I decided, yes, you know what, this will be a photo book. And so slowly, I just did one copy of it, and slowly I realized that in order for my work to travel, I definitely need a larger edition. And in 2016, I self-published 150 copies of an edition of 150 copies of the book, and 2 years after that, I was invited by Echo Eshon and Anastasia Federova to be a part in the exhibition that they curated, Calvert 22, a gallery in Shoreditch that doesn't exist anymore. Very sad, but it's life. But it was a great exhibition, and I was showing my work among 14 other practitioners from Central Eastern Europe, whose work was very deeply rooted in what I found so interesting. And it was really the first time that I found myself positioned in this context, and I saw that that's a real big interest. That there was even DJs like Kedr Livański, who played at the after party, and her interest in that context and sampling music that you grew up with and reimagining it now was something that I just yes, I can see. Yeah, now I can see that there is a trend, definitely, and almost fetishizing that.
Yeah, very much.
Very much. Yeah, but it's something that also for me gave sort of roots to my practice, and I found, especially within that show, Post-Soviet Visions, it was called. I really found myself relating to other photographers, a tradition of or an interest in documenting our roots, that there is time and space for it. It made me feel good, to be honest. I know that there is, for me, the problem with post-Soviet visions problem was never Soviet, so it's things like this, but that's why you have to, I think it's important to just pay attention, but at the same time, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's that fetishization of the past. I think there are two things here. It's seen primarily in the generation that was born after the system has changed, or people that were very young when this happened, because I think it's easier for us to distance ourselves. We've never experienced the horrible sides of socialism, and some stories that we hear from our families.
Like borders crossing.
Yeah, and even the fact that
empty shelves,
queues
most of
in
us
shops.
can relate to now.
So what we look at is this aesthetic, this artistic aspect of that, and also I see many people our age, not necessarily artists, but just ordinary people, being very interested in this aesthetics. So, for example, getting socialist gadgets like those glasses that you could get in milk bars only, or plates made in that one particular ceramic factory that was the main provider.
Or the wall units, the
wall units, the furniture as well. So it's really interesting how everyone is coming back to that aesthetics now. So another question is, do you think that these spaces, factories, etc., should be reused for new businesses or made into protected buildings, almost like the statues of socialism? So I think it really depends. So in Warsaw,
that's a very problematic.
This question has been a part of a huge public debate, and there were buildings like, for example, Syreni Śpiew. That's the name of the nightclub that was in one of the ex-party listed buildings, and I mean, I personally think that it's really fascinating to see what happens with the buildings that used to be, headquarters of a political party right now. And there is this one particular building in our hometown in Suwałki, which used to be the regional party headquarters, and it's now a school. It's now a high school.
Oh yeah.
And I find that very interesting, because people who go there, not all of them actually know that that's the history of the building. And I don't think we should just demolish them, because it's a huge part of our history, of our national identity. But seeing
protect maybe sounds.
I think seeing those spaces in the new dynamics can create. That can create some really interesting conclusions about how we relate to it now, and but then again, this is a part of a bigger conversation about gentrification.
Yeah.
About how the fact that places are getting more and more crowded, cities are getting more populated, how this influences the aesthetics of our public space, and if you take, even in the UK, if you take places like Battersea Power Station, for example, I mean, it's all the part of the same question: do we preserve, do we demolish, or do we reuse?
Yeah.
And it depends.
Well, for me, I photograph these spaces for that very reason. I think it's a great testimony of our collective history, our lived experiences that definitely influence the life and the way of life now. So, we're both not living in Poland, and we both are looking at Polish history together. So there are certain things, I guess, that come out of this lived experience that joins all the Slavic countries that used to be Soviet
Or socialist.
or socialist, and for me, whether the buildings should be preserved or not. I don't know. I think the system gave gave most people a really hard time, and so it's not the most positive association you can make with it. But reusing them definitely makes sense. I think if, especially if they have been designed in a particular way, or they feel sort of integral to identity of a space. And again, that's very individual. I personally think that that's just something that naturally resolves itself within cities, and photography has this beautiful way of preserving the present moment, and I guess that's my contribution to talking about what our society went through. There was another question. Do you think the predominance of monolith socialist structures also trivialization and expulsion of negative assumptions regarding their regime? I think I read it really weirdly. I don't understand.
I think.
Okay.
Okay, my understanding of this question is whether the fact that we have those structures basically makes people trivialize the negative assumptions of the system. I think that's very much country dependent, actually.
Yeah.
Because there are those you have buildings like that in Poland, but you also have buildings like that in Romania, and it's a part of the same wider history. But then, the very the kind of very core differences of how people treated those how people treat those buildings right now, and what they went through. I think that's really relative to the history of the place. It definitely, the fact that most of the post-socialist cities and countries look like that, it definitely normalizes the presence of those buildings, which then means that some of the main historical monumental buildings that perhaps have very negative associations, this can definitely get lost because that landscape is normalized. But I'd say it's very much country and city and context dependent.
And I think it's also something that we're putting out there through as the research, and what comes from it is sort of outside of our control. I think the assumptions that are made, I mean, these are facts. This is what happened. This is what it looks like, and how that influences each and one of us. I think that's a very individual thing. Since our generation didn't actually experience the hardships of socialism, do you think fetishizing the socialist aesthetic or romanticizing the era is dangerous in any way? I think it is.
I think you should ask my grandma this question.
Yeah.
Because it's if we put too much emphasis on the beautiful parts of that time,
or making it cool, I guess.
Making it cool.
That's dangerous.
Yeah, it makes people forget that actually thousands, or if not millions, of people in Poland specifically were very much suffering and were affected by some of the rules that the regime has produced.
Yeah, we're isolated. Fed propaganda, which is very it's then and now. I think we're all subject to this, but obviously. In that time, the ways and the extent that the leaders went to, was quite crazy, and that's something that is captured in the photographs as well. But I think, for me, again, this project, Udarny, of course, yes, it's the discovery comes from the socialist time. There are still certificates with Lenin and Stalin and. Glorifying the workers that did so well. However, it's it's for me, it's just a coincidence. Like, you know, it's like Disco Polo, the earlier project that we've done. Yes, it is in post-socialist Poland, but it's really, you know, we're not photographing post-socialist spaces there. We're photographing the hybrids, like I said, you know, things that just this this
it's like
mixture of you know, a post-socialist block, but painted in the early 2000 in pink and yellow, and it's crazy, and
it's like a
why does
time
it look like
machine.
that? Yes, it's like you know, and so these mixed influences. So it's not just it's actually the reality now, you know, and it's not that I think it's only the socialist aesthetics. I think it's
It's
our
the
aesthetic.
interaction. It's
Yeah.
the interaction of socialist aesthetics with the new system. I think that's what we've been trying to capture through actually both of these projects.
Yeah.
And
Another question.
again, no, on that question still, I think to bring up my grandma again.
Yeah.
I think for her, the idea that people from our generation are genuinely amazed and fascinated by this aesthetics, she just doesn't understand it, because for her this is associated with the suffering that she has been through during that system.
But you want to preserve that as well, you know. I think that's the thing. It's something that now the way that people interact with each other in cities privately, that's something that she's talking about as well. And so that's negative or not, it's a document of
Sure, but I think it is very, very important, and thank you for raising this point in your question, to remember that there was the other side of this whole movement, of this whole system. And who knows, perhaps in our next project we can actually explore we can explore that, and what kind of dynamics this romanticization fetishization creates, and whether, you know, it makes people less aware of the actually very atrocious and terrible past to some extent.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. But past and present, I think, you know, we're facing what we're facing living here as migrants. There are different things that come uh, with this system too. And that's maybe the new projects ahead. But we've got another question. Natalia, I really enjoyed your essay on the similarities between socialism and capitalism. Can you talk more about it? What made you write it? How this idea emerged?
So can I just confirm, do you mean the essay that was the last part of the Udarny Trud?
The reflections part.
The reflections part.
That's what it means.
If that's what you mean, which I think that's it. So basically it was the fact that at the time I was a little bit disillusioned about the current labour market situation, and the fact that there are so many jobs that don't necessarily bring any social value. Now, how do we understand social value? That's a different question. But I was reading a lot about the fact that jobs that are essential to the functioning of our society are actually jobs that are paid the lowest. So, for example, cleaners, teachers, you know, people who like workers who take the rubbish out. Even in London, tube workers, bus drivers. These are some of the professions that our city simply couldn't function without. But then there are the professions that are paid very, very little in relation to, you know, policy officials, corporate lawyers, insurance workers, and I was reading a lot about that, and alongside of this, Paulina and I had many conversations about this particular project, and to me, juxtaposing those two attitudes to labour in completely different systems that had completely different objectives, because, you know, socialism centralized production, whereas the current system, it's all about individual, but some things haven't necessarily changed, and I think that also the reason why in the exhibition this part of the essay is a handout is that that's something that I would like to explore further. And I'd like this to be a conversation starter. I'd like this to be something that we can take away and think about. You know, we see this cult of labor, we see this, we see the working class heroes, and then we go back to our working lives and we sit in the office for 12 hours sometimes, and we see this as something completely different. But the question here is it that different?
Is it that exactly when you know, you have companies, big corporations, which literally make you spend your life
Yeah.
around the place that you're working in. And that's something that we found in this project. In these photographs, in the archival material, it's very clear how the factory was the center point of private life as well.
And we see this now very clearly, the same way that that factory in Alytus had parties for people working there, had special events. You know, if you look at the big tech companies right now, for example, they they're constructed in a way that you don't have to leave. So you have childcare facilities, you have
Leisure
canteens,
activities.
you have leisure activities. Some of them you have swimming pools, ping pong tables, you name it, and it's all designed that your workplace becomes your whole universe, your whole world. So you don't have to, you know, even have beds in some of those companies, so you never have to leave.
Just work and play is there.
And how is this different to the attitude that people had towards their factories during
to the idea of work
socialism?
competing and the Udarniks, like we,
It's, you know, if you break it down like this, in my opinion at least, is that it's not actually as different as we think.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something that we would like to I would like to explore. And now the whole coronavirus, you know, cities going on lockdown, that also gives us some interesting insights about what kind of professions are essential to the functioning of our societies.
Yes.
Also the fact that the core workers, the people who basically ran London, for example, they can't just work from home. You know, some the frontline workers, they still have to be around, even though it's really dangerous. And this again is something that adds up to the attitudes that we have towards labor right now. That some of the professions that are perhaps less regarded in terms of social status are actually at the very, very core of our functioning. And I just think that's fascinating. And juxtaposing this with socialist ideas of labor, you know, that's just a really big issue to unpack.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yes, no, it was. I think I just want to say, if we, I think we don't have any more questions. I just want to say that the project is on display at Centrala Gallery until 27th of March. Whether it will be open or not for you to see, I don't know. But obviously there is documentation of the show on the gallery website, my website, and I'm sure you're able to find it. It was really wonderful experience working with the gallery. I think it's a perfect space for this sort of project. And Digbeth, you know, very post-industrial area. Centrala in itself being a sort of old factory lends itself beautifully to this show, I think. Even the beams, which you can see in the archival footage, because the exhibition is accompanied by some archival films made in the factory, obviously in the propaganda fashion, but they still, I think, give an insight to the way it used to be. Yeah, it's a great experience. We were initially talking about doing a book, and I think when the gallery reached out to me to propose the exhibition, it was just something that felt really right, and then together we teamed up to make this make this possible. And we've got one last, oh, maybe not last, but we've got a question, another question. As a EECEE artist, do you feel that you have to make work about socialism, or is it more you're interested in the topic? For me, again, I will start just because I feel the answer failed itself. Sorry. No. I didn't really. I when I started making this sort of work, it wasn't really socialism I was interested in. I was interested in, well, like I said, certain feeling, certain nostalgia, certain being in between two realities, the East and the West, and that's something that I saw very vividly from my town. From, you know, something that used to strike me was the American names, often spelled incorrectly. Malibu or American Bar or Atlantis, or things that sound really, you know, foreign, but
are
extravagant,
misspelled.
are misspelled, but like, you know, palm trees in the middle of nowhere. So there, it was very clear to me that there is a definite interest and longing towards this American dream, towards this Western reality that, why would you call your shop Las Vegas if it doesn't mean that it will attract customers? Well, that obviously meant that this is this person's idea to
that's an identity issue.
Yes, give it an identity that will be better than calling a Polish name, for example. So that started my interest. I was for me it was initially just a bit quite humoristic, but then digging further in it, I realized, perhaps it's because there was a lot of migrants living and working in the States, seeing the reality there, coming back and recreating that through the actual decoration of the public space and the decision that they made within the buildings that they owned or within the businesses that they owned. So for me, that was something that started that project. And of course, socialism plays a huge role in this, because it's the isolation and the lack of input from the West for such a long time that I think created this longing, or contributed to the creation of this longing. So that's how socialism became present in my work, because I've just been always interested in public space. So photographing current public space, you have the mix. After Disco Polo came out, and I've sort of stopped, not stopped, but considered the project finished. I was still working towards the project, but it seemed that I was more drawn to the post-socialist spaces, because that was really why it all started, how it all merged into this hybrid, like I keep saying. So in wall unit, socialism and post-socialist spaces was something definitely I deliberately seeked for, something that I even seeked for the most socialist iconic buildings and interiors, that elements that to me seemed like this is something that definitely I would see in my grandma's friend's house, or in the spaces that they would take me to, because it's their generation, and it's that I was essentially trying to recreate this feeling that I had as a little girl going to all these buildings worked on.
Yeah, I think for me, I know I never felt like I have to make work about socialism. It's more that it always just comes up somehow. I mean, when I was studying anthropology in London, I never wanted to look at socialism. It never even crossed my mind. And I was looking at different things. I was looking at anthropology of religion. I was looking at urban anthropology. I was looking at nostalgia and anthropology of emotions. And I didn't really intend to do any projects on post-socialism, but I happened to have a very good professor who was she was specializing in post-socialist studies, and she actually spoke some Polish as well, even though that wasn't her first language. And we just had a conversation about emotions and nostalgia, and how is this reflected in post-socialist cities. And I think that really sparked my interest. And I also thought, why would I go and do research about something I don't know? Because the journey I would have to go through to really understand that place would be so much longer than if I went back to Poland and looked at something that I know very much, but just looked at it with a slightly different perspective. And that's what I did. And then again, I started doing some research about other things. And even this particular project, I was looking at labor right now in capitalist societies, and suddenly this came up, and I started looking at labor in the post and socialist context. And in my case, I never look for it, and I don't think in general as an artist or researcher or writer from Central Eastern Europe, I don't think you should feel obliged to do that ever. I think if that's the scene where you feel the most comfortable in, then definitely go for it. But just because that's our background doesn't mean that we have to do it.
I think it's the question why we're interested in it as well. It's like why would you do that? Why would you explore that? And again, for me, it's a big part why I'm not there. You know,
Yeah.
it's like I didn't like my surroundings when I was growing up, and I learned to understand them in a different way when I was coming back. And I think it's not just okay. You know, Poland has this part of history. Let me jump on this and photograph it. It's very specific, and I think it's the things that made us both feel uncomfortable, perhaps, for at least for me, in certain works that I felt a bit confused. That's what drew me into it.
Yeah, definitely. And for me, also the fact that in anthropology, there are a lot of questions about, as an ethnographer, for example, where do you place yourself within your research? And depending on where do you decide to do your research, this can be really problematic, and it can introduce power structures that are very hard to comprehend. And for me, it was almost the easiest choice to go somewhere that I, in many ways, belong, but I also have this external view in it now, and it was basically just taking an easy route, almost going back to a place that I knew wouldn't create any of the challenges that some of my colleagues had when they were looking at research in different parts of the world. For example, I was just like, okay, I can go back to Poland and I can basically question everything that I've seen growing up, and that's what I did.
But I think it's something that, again, why would you go elsewhere when it's something that we know so well? And I think the most interesting thing for me is rediscovering it.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think it's something that we can feel ownership towards. It's not we're not going on a safari here. It's something that shaped us, and why and how is why we're doing this work.
Yeah, and it's important to question that and question yourself and question your perception of the world as you evolve, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, well, it's time to to wrap up. There was no more questions. I think we've sort of said it all. Really.
Yes, thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Centrala, for having us.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks for all the fantastic questions. And unfortunately, on this occasion of the global pandemics, we weren't able to see you all in person. Which
but we hope you're safe at home.
We hope you're safe at home. But if you would like to continue this conversation, which we would very much welcome, you can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Instagram. And if you have any further questions, or if you just want to chat about post-socialism, or not only, just let us know. And thank you very much again for making time.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in. I hope you survived it and you stayed with us till the end.
Thanks a lot, and stay safe.
Stay safe, everybody. Look after yourselves.